I'll just answer it in one of the first recorded attempts on his life in 1934, when there was no question of Pakistan, there was no question of partition, when there was no question of the 55 crores that in today's accusations they say, he gifted them to Pakistan. No question of any of those justifications of his murder, and yet in Pune, an attempt was made on his life. And what was he doing then? He wasn't even conducting a satyagraha because the salt satyagraha had been suspended. So he wasn't even fighting the British, that, the allies of the British, the RSS or the Hindu Mahasabha wanted to kill him. What was he doing that time? Shireen, you must remember. He was on his Harijan Uddhar Yatra throughout India. He was going around forcing the caste wells to be opened to the Harijans, the Dalits today. He was going and performing satyagrahas in temples for allowing the entry of Dalits. And the Sanatanis were livid about it. And so the first attempt, a hand grenade was thrown on his car to kill him.
Welcome to Baobab, Redwood and Neem, an interview series by Peace Vigil, which seeks to inspire actions to protect and promote peace. Today we'll be talking to author and activist Tushar Gandhi, who has spent years researching the murder of his great-grandfather, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. His book is A Chronicle of Gandhi's Last Days, The Conspiracy to Murder Him, and the Investigations and Trial of Nathuram Godse and Other Co-Conspirators.
Today in Baobab, Redwood and Neem, we'll talk to Tushar Gandhi, author and activist, great-grandson of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Tushar, hello and welcome to Baobab, Redwood and Neem.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and my greetings to the listeners of Baobab, Redwood and Neem, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Tushar. Tushar, Mohandas Gandhi, or Mahatma Gandhi as he's known by many, has a larger-than-life image. Most people I have met consider him one of the greatest human beings of our times. Some, and that number is not huge, consider him a villain. And in recent years, there is a growing number of people who consider him problematic. Caste and race have dominated that narrative, and we must not ignore that. But today, I want to know who Gandhi is for you. What does he mean to you?
Well, to me, he has always meant great-grandfather, Bapu. And all the other identities don't mean anything. For me, he is Bapu, he's my great-grandfather. That's whom I cherish as an ancestor. So, to me, the other public persona don't matter because the public persona, his public persona, doesn't belong to me. Bapu is mine. I only share him with my family members, but the public persona is universal. So everybody has a right over that persona, whether to worship or to vilify. So I'm not bothered about the Mahatma at all, or the father of the nation also. To me, Ba and Bapu are what matter.
Tushar, does that make it a bit tricky? Because when such a huge personality is being talked about, it becomes very hard to separate that personal with the larger image that he has. I heard your in-depth interview on the research you did on Gandhi's murder in the podcast All Indians Matter. And your book, Let's Kill Gandhi, has more details coming from that research. The subtitle is very aptly called The Chronicle of His Last Days, the Conspiracy, Murder, Investigations and Trial. What is it that prompted you to undertake this research? Were there things that you didn't understand, or were there missing links?
Shireen, there were many issues in this, what prompted me to write the book. The natural inquisitiveness of human beings was one of the reasons. To come to terms with the anger that felt within me was also one of the reasons that prompted me to try and find out what the truth was. And the many different conflicting reports that I grew up with, the talk in the family, the extended family, the whispers that I heard growing up, the bewilderment of lots of people about the incident. And then when I grew up, and as the voices of the Sangh became more and more prominent, the justifications for the murder, all this created a lot of confusion in my mind. And when I started taking on a little bit of a public persona, people expected me to answer all these questions that were going around in society. And that's when I realized that it became my responsibility. If I was to give answers, I had to know them myself before I started talking about them. And so I decided that I would find out about it. The other thing was, I used to always feel very, knowing all this background that I talked about, whispers in the family, the talk in the press, the various books written about, created a lot of curiosity in me. And I used to think that I started realizing that if I was to argue his case, then I had to know my facts well, and what I knew was very superfluous. And so, I realized that I couldn't have half knowledge. I would not be able to do justice to, because over the time, the questions started becoming more and more belligerent, and the accusations against him, I realized that they were being quite creative in, making accusations and things, and they were doing it in a very systematic manner, which was becoming more and more believable. And one of the bewilderments that I had was that all the biographies of Bapu that I read, even the film, Richard Attenborough's film, when you saw that, nobody talked about the failed attempts. How many failed attempts had happened on his life. Nobody talked about the attempt on the 20th, just 10 days before his murder. And even when they portrayed his murder, it felt as if, the murderer was there, fortunately armed, and he just saw that he had an opportunity and he pulled out his gun and shot him dead. And so the whole conspiracy was getting, sort of clouded over. And I also saw the tendency amongst the Gandhians, whenever we started talking about Bapu's murder, they would say, no, don't talk about his murder, talk about his life. That's more important. And I sort of felt that, no, when there was a concerted campaign to demonize Bapu, using his murder, then it became a duty to give the other side of the story also as firmly as the accusations were being made. So all these things combined together finally pushed me in that direction of finding out for myself. It was a journey of discovery It was a journey of coming to terms. It was a journey of trying to rid myself of the anger. Of course, I realized that I miserably failed in that, because the more I found out about it, the more I realized how eerily close we are to those times that led to Bapu's murder. And, so the anger didn't go. The anger, it wasn't as if I found an escape valve for the anger. If anything, I found a direction for that anger.
I also feel that the Sangh, and actually for that matter, all fascist organizations, always deny things, from their past, from their history, to suit the needs, whatever political needs they have. And that constantly has happened not only with regard to Gandhi, but with regard to the freedom struggle as a whole, the RSS playing absolutely no role, in fact, counterproductive role in that. What surprises me, however, is that people who mean well, or at least they say they mean well, Gandhians, although I have my doubts whether they're Gandhians, also don't want to discuss these issues, just like you mentioned, that they don't want to discuss the death of Gandhi. But I feel that his death is as important as his life, because as he said, his life is his message, and the way he died says something about that message, says how powerful that message was, that, people killed him for it. So I want you to please talk to us about why there is this reluctance about talking of his death.
I think somewhere or the other, it is the ostrich attitude. They just want to hide their heads and believe that everything that was wrong will go away. Because they realize that in India, at least, history is repeating itself very soon. Generally, you feel that the mistakes of the past take a long, long time to be repeated. But in India, it hasn't taken more than 5 decades for all the mistakes that were committed, all the sins that were committed, to re-emerge in society. And that's making these people uncomfortable, because they have also become lethargic. They don't want to, they were reluctant satyagrahis. And even Bapu realized this in his lifetime, that they were reluctant satyagrahis, all of them. And that is where he realized that it would take a sacrifice to save his country. And you must remember, Shireen, that it was his sacrifice that at least kept India on the path of sanity for the first 5 decades of independence.
Yeah, I would like you to explain that a bit further, because you see, I heard those interviews with Ashraf, but many people have not. And you know what? I never thought of it in the way that you explained, that how his murder perhaps kept India sane. And I'd like you to please explain a bit further.
Shireen, you must remember that India was hurtling into an abyss of insanity immediately before and after independence. And if that had not been checked, India would have died in birth. The idea of India would have died in birth itself. It would have imploded. It would have, sort of degenerated into chaos, because we were hurtling towards that direction. The communal hate and violence was spreading like an inferno across India. And I'm talking about the undivided India. Even at that time, though Pakistan had happened, we were still, that identity was still common. The impression of two different nations had not still sunk into our psyche.
Also, the
realization was very fresh. Yeah, the borders were porous. And so when I talk about India of that time, I talk about that united India, the pre-independence India, if you wish to say that. And it was hurtling dangerously into anarchy. There was no question about it. And how many times would Gandhi have gone on a fast? Immediately after independence, he went on fast twice to stop the insanity that was happening, first in Calcutta, the second time in Delhi. But the way the incidents were happening, he would have had to go across the length and breadth of India. And when I say that, I include Pakistan also in it, in his time. He would have had to go to Pakistan, he would have had to go to both sides of Pakistan and every province of India to and fast over there to stop, put an end to the internecine feud that was happening. It was impossible for him to do that. And he realized that. And that is why, if you look at the last 6 months of his life, he kept continuously talking about death, of having to die or being dead already. He kept even saying that you're now listening to just a corpse, I'm dead. The thing that made him so depressed that he wished death. What caused that was seeing the insincerity about nonviolence of his people, the disunity of his people, the hate in the country. And he realized that that was the poison that was going to kill his country. And that was his sorrow, which said, I'm not going to live to see this. I refuse to live to see this. And that was his death wish. That is what caused him to say, I have been betrayed. These people have betrayed me. Those
So
whom
for
I considered to be my own have
true.
betrayed me, and I don't want to live with this betrayal.
So something very deep in this, Tushar. Of course, there are people like Godse who were the opposite of what Gandhi stood for. So, those people we can identify, we know, okay, these people hate him to the extent or hate the idea of coexistence and non-violence to the extent that they're willing to kill. But then there is this group of people who we think are our allies, are our friends, and use the word betrayal. And betrayal only comes from people who we think are our allies. It doesn't come from people who we know are against our ideas.
Mhm.
And what comes across very clearly is that betrayal was extremely strong. The very idea of nonviolence and justice that was betrayed by some of the top leaders there because they were now in charge.
Shireen, over here, I would just say that for Bapu, the means were more important than the ends. And he fought the entire freedom movement in being very, very careful about the means employed. He never ever took a shortcut. He never ever compromised. He never ever abandoned his principle in becoming practical. To him, that was not something he would even consider. But when the notion that freedom is now within our grasp occurred to all the people around him, whom he considered to be his own people, he realized, he saw the lust for power becoming more and more predominant in their actions, and he realized that in that moment, they had abandoned the purity of means for the goal, and the goal had become much more important for them than the means. But if you look at Bapu, right till the very end, he continuously kept talking about the purity of means being much more important. And he continuously kept pointing out to the fact that if we start compromising now, that will be the start of the rot setting in. And I want to just make this very clear to you. Bapu was not disillusioned by the betrayal of the top few leadership of the Congress. Bapu was saddened by the complete betrayal of all the people that he considered his own, because In Bapu's definition, there were no special select few. He was never bothered about that. He always considered everyone and the final human being to be as important or equally important. And he, right till the end, he treated it that way. And he saw when violence flared up across India, he realized that not only the leaders were not with him, that Indians of that time were not with him either. And they had also abandoned his ways. And he stood like Gurudev's poem. He stood and walked alone, Ekla Chalo. That became his tragedy at the end of his life.
But Tushar, don't you think that it is the leadership that has the responsibility of making sure that the large majority stays with those ideals, follows those principles? Because it's the leaders that we look up to. And if the leaders abandon it, the rest of us also feel that, okay, it's not important.
Well, Shireen, I feel that when you see the rewards, it becomes very difficult to resist the temptation. And everyone, right from the top to the bottom, saw the reward of freedom and sort of decided that enough sacrifices had been made. Now was the time to feast on the victor's feast. And so nobody was willing. Even the ideology that made it as an excuse to kill Gandhi was not willing to go and say, okay, you've been talking about not accepting this. We also don't accept it. Why don't we come together? These Sanghis who shout from the rooftops that they were, they felt as if they had been vivisected themselves when the nation was partitioned, did not even write a letter to Bapu saying, we oppose the partition and we're going to fight against it. Will you fight with us? What they did was they sent a hitman to kill him. And my anger, Shireen, I told you there was anger in. I have never felt anger against Murshid. Because he was basically a hitman. He was a gunslinger for hire. The Sangh is so cowardly that they can't even stand up and claim honestly that yes, we oppose that old man and yes, we got him murdered. Because we believe in the ideology of murder. They don't even have that much honesty to say that. They sacrifice the killer and conveniently have been washing their hands off that. And they continue to do that. After in independent India also, they have continuously kept, playing a holy of blood and then washing themselves off.
Tushar, I think it's because for me, at least as a peace educator, I find that there is a very deep reason for it. And that is that the vast majority will never accept the ideology of hate. In their hearts, they may, of course, because of the way politics is set up, they may end up voting or, because of their economic reasons or fear factors or whatever. But in the very essence of humanness lies this idea of cooperation and coexistence and so on, which Gandhi represented, which the Sangh has never represented. And so I think the Sangh can never actually own up to what they do because they know that the vast majority will never support them.
Unfortunately, Shireen, I don't share that belief of yours. I have come to the belief that in India today, hate is the Rashtra Dharma. It is the ideology and religion of Indians. I don't see any hope. I used to pride myself as being an optimist. And I used to always say that I'm not giving up. But day by day, that optimism has diminished. And the realization has happened that we are basically filled with hate. and
Why is that?
irrational hate.
Why is that?
It is in our culture, Shri. The period when we sort of adopted non-violence and peace was the artificial period. A culture that for 5,000 years has been persecuting a segment of their own people. Don't talk about Christians, don't talk about Muslims. We don't consider them to be human beings. So let's forget about them. Talk about the Dalits. For 5,000 years and more, we have denied them the notion of even being human. And if that is our culture, then hate is our culture, persecution is our culture, oppression is our culture. And Gandhi is an aberration.
And also that stratification that is there in society because of that. That whole thing that, if even within a family, there is all this stratification.
We
the
are
man at the
stratified
top.
on gender.
Yeah.
We are stratified on gender. We are stratified on caste. We are stratified on class. We are stratified on religion. You name a possibility of a division, and we are divided on that. And there is hate in that division.
Tushar, it's funny you say this because many years ago in California, I was on a speaking tour, and this lady was telling me how great India is. And, coming from India, I was very happy that she was saying this. And then she said, "You gave Gandhi to the world." And I said, "No, actually, we needed him the most." So that's why he appeared, in India, because our society, certainly, as you're saying, with caste and gender inequalities, it is a horrible culture. The problem is that I think a lot of us don't admit it, even though we know it. We are unwilling to admit it. Gandhi admitted it and tried to do something about it. And the cowardness that you mentioned, I think that is also something that has to do with a moral character, but also, Tushar, it has to do with what you're gaining from the system. And I think a lot of us don't stand up because we're gaining from the system, either because of caste dynamics, gender dynamics, financial stuff.
True, absolutely. And that is where the selfishness, that's where when I said that, now means are least important. The ends are what matters. And the ends are always the rewards that we look at.
There is something in fear. It's a very natural thing. People are fearful of their lives, of their family's situation, or so on. But I think once that fear goes, and for most of us, it doesn't go easily. That's the reason why he was a Mahatma. I know you disagree with that term at times, but there's something much greater in him that we don't find. And we were fortunate to have him. We don't have those kind of leaders or heroes today. So what remains perhaps is that chance to hold on to some parts at least of his philosophy and do better. Like you're saying, in India, the chances right now are very low. And it is a very depressing state. But is there something that you think may save the day?
I have been asking myself this question a lot, and the answer that keeps coming back is unfortunately, we don't have a Gandhi who will sacrifice themselves to again save us today. I don't know, and the fear that I have is that then in that case, how many will need to be sacrificed to shock us out of our complacence? Would we need another Holocaust? Would that be what will shock us out of this situation? What would it be? How many? What would be the volume? Because I don't see anybody whose death could shock Indians out of this insanity that they are suffering from. And Shireen, you must remember that fear is the seed of hate. Hate is born out of that fear and that insecurity and the prejudice that we allow to build up within us, resentment, prejudice. And it's also because we have sort of told ourselves that we must be tolerant. I hate that word. I
Well,
hate,
your
absolutely
great
hate
grandfather hated it as well.
tolerance.
Your
Yes.
great grandfather said that tolerance is a bad word. I don't like to use it, he said.
Yes. Because, we sort of tell ourselves I'm tolerant while we are convincing ourselves that beyond a point I'm not going to. I'm tolerant, but I'm tolerant up to a limit. And after that, my outburst is justified. Because यार मैं 5 साल तक टॉलरेंट रहा तो अब तो मैं एक विस्फोट कर सकता हूँ. I
Plus,
can explode now. I can
yeah.
explode now because I've been tolerant for 5 years.
Yes. Plus, there is
And
this
so,
sense that I'm doing somebody a favor. I'm
yeah,
not on equal terms. I'm doing the Muslims a favor. I'm doing the Dalits a favor. I'm doing my wife a favor by letting her wear jeans,
yeah.
outside the house. And I think this
I
whole
know
concept.
I'm so modern that I allow my wife to wear jeans and I allow my daughter to wear torn jeans.
But Tushar, I'm also reminded of the fact that ideas do live on. People die or are killed, and their ideas live on. So I'm hoping that something or several things will happen that will perhaps push the people of India, and hopefully even because if one believes in Gandhi, I think hearts change, and perhaps even the leadership towards a path that will be better. But I want to ask a question here with regards to your book. The sense that I got is that the reason behind Gandhi's killing was not partition. It was not the Hindu-Muslim divide. It was something much more sinister. Could you please talk to us about that?
I'll just answer it in one of the first recorded attempts on his life in 1934. When there was no question of Pakistan, there was no question of partition, when there was no question of the 55 crores that in today's accusations, they say, he gifted them to Pakistan. No question of any of those justifications of his murder. And yet in Pune, an attempt was made on his life. And what was he doing then? He wasn't even conducting a satyagraha because the salt satyagraha had been suspended. So he wasn't even fighting the British, that, the allies of the British, the RSS or the Hindu Mahasabha wanted to kill him. What was he doing that time? Shireen, you must remember. He was on his Harijan Uddhar Yatra throughout India. He was going around forcing the caste wells to be opened to the Harijans, the Dalits today. He was going and performing satyagrahas in temples for allowing the entry of Dalits. And the Sanatanis were livid about it. And so the first attempt, a hand grenade was thrown on his car to kill him. It wasn't a firecracker, it was a hand grenade. The hand grenade exploded. Instead of inside his car, it exploded on the road side. But it was a matter of, fractions of seconds that he was saved. And that is what we must remember, that attempts on his life were made more when he was working for his pet subject of the emancipation of Harijans. And it was only at the end that these people hit on the excuse which could become popular of the Hindu-Muslim divide and the partition and all that followed. And the entire statement of Godse, which is today become the Bible of the Sanghis, is an afterthought. It is an afterthought that, okay, now we murdered Gandhi. Now let's create a whole scenario which one fine day will find acceptance amongst the people of India. You look at it, you look at how it has been fabricated, and you will realize that it has been done as a thought after an action.
So tell us a little bit more about that statement, Tushar.
Well, the main points of the statement is that he created the communal politics, and I'm going to draw parallels with modern day India. The resurgence of the Sangh used the same excuse. Advani coined the term Tushtikaran, the politics of what was patronage that he started talking about. Godse said the same thing. He said in the Khilafat movement, Gandhi made the Hindu-Muslim issue into a political issue, conveniently forgetting that before Gandhi, Tilak had offered special terms to Muslims to try and bring them into the political mainstream of opposing the British. The whole Lucknow Pact that Tilak made with the Muslim leadership of that time was much more of a Tushtikaran than what Bapu did with Khilafat. Khilafat was just a tool, a political tool. It was a political tool, don't denying that. But at that point of time, it required that kind of political. Khilafat did not give any special favors to the Muslims like the Lucknow Pact was giving. And yet, Bapu was crucified for 40 years later by people who
Yeah.
claim to be the descendants of the Kesari group in the Indian political scene. So that was, I'm going to go back and forth, Shirin, because it's very important to realize that they have used the same set of excuses over and over again, and we have fallen prey to the same set of excuses. They don't have to go and invent any new excuse to beguile us. And so it is not their expertise, it is our weakness that is to be blamed. And so that was the first excuse. The second excuse was that he used to go to save the Muslims, he never saved the Hindus. Today, whenever you talk about atrocities on Muslims, what about restarts about, what about that Hindu killed there and that Hindu raped over there and that Hindu something like that? Just yesterday, this incident of the Kerala nuns traveling by train being heckled by Bajrang Dal and harassed by the police in Uttar Pradesh. And things. I tweeted about that. And one of the Sanghi trolls started posting on my timeline saying so and so priest was accused of child molestation and so nun was excused of exposed for this and so. Immediately. And I realized that there were less people influenced by my tweet and more people being influenced by that whataboutery. And the first incident of public whataboutery was by Nathuram Godse in court, saying, what about, why didn't he go to save the Hindus? Conveniently forgetting that in Noakhali he went to save the Hindus. If you just want to look at it from the Hindu-Muslim thing and not as a human tragedy, then even there he is lying, because whom was he saving in Noakhali?
Plus,
okay,
Tushar,
I agree.
Wherever we are, that context holds true for us. So, if we are in Pakistan and there are atrocities against Hindus and Christians, we are going to be talking about that because Pakistan is a Muslim majority country. If we are in India, the context will change. And I think for Gandhi, there are certain concepts that didn't have a name in those days, but now they do. So protecting minorities is a thing today. I mean, it's part of international law, which in those days, there was no international law, but Gandhi was already talking about it. And of course, law has no meaning for people who are governed by a set of very unjust social and cultural practices, such as caste system.
Yeah, I agree with that. So continuing on that whole thing about Godse's statement in court, he said, I got angry because my country was vivisected and I couldn't tolerate the pieces that my motherland was shattered into, and that's why I murdered him. Look today, the whole campaign of demonizing students and the CAA protesters and calling them the Tukde Tukde gang. What is that? Again, the same strategy is being used of evoking patriotism, nationalism, and things. Godse did it then, and the current lot of Sanghis are doing the same thing today. The
Even with the
parallels
farmers.
are absolutely plain to be
Yes.
seen. Farmers protest, they become Khalistanis. So partition again. So what was used 70 years ago, these people are not inventing anything new. They are utilizing the same excuses today. And that is where Gandhi's murder becomes relevant today also. The only thing that can't be repeated or is not repeated till now, I'm sure one of these days they'll come up with something innovative on that too, is the 55 crores that Bapu is supposed to have gifted Pakistan.
But you
And
have explained in that he didn't
absolutely.
gift that. It was a pool of
It-
money that India as the parent country held at independence, and Pakistan had no money because it was created out of India. So in simple terms, that kitty had to be divided, and Pakistan as a new country that came out of India had rights to that money. How could it
See,
survive without any money?
and it wasn't even as if we had the money. The money was with the British. And the British said that we are holding on to this pool of the common kitty of undivided India. We want you to come to terms with each other and decide who gets what, how much, and tell us that, and then we'll give it to you. And so at the time when Pakistan came into existence on 14th August 1947, there was no there was no accord on how much was Pakistan's share. But now when the country was coming into being, they needed money right from that point of time. And so 200 crores were given to them at that point of time as a interim 20 crores, sorry, and 200 million to 20 crores as an ad hoc amount. And it was decided that once we arrive at the agreeable formula, the rest of the money, if there is more to be given, that will be given to you. If you your share proves to be less than what this is, then you refund that money to us. And that was a bilateral treaty signed by Nehru and Patel for India and Liaquat Ali and others for Pakistan. So it was a bilateral treaty between the two. Gandhi was not any part of that negotiation, nor was he a signatory to that accord.
But Tushar, he was the moral compass that made sure that, if you are not doing what you were supposed to do, this old elderly man will come and say, look, you better, do what you said you will. And I think that moral compass is needed by any society. In tribal society.
It is always there.
Yeah. In Africa, for instance, there are the elders, in the tribal cultures, they tell you, if you do something wrong, they will bring you back. And I think we are missing that, or we have been missing that for quite a few years now, some decades now in India, and perhaps all over the world, as far as I can.
We've become like the Tron son, who doesn't want any control over his actions. He just wants to do whatever he likes. And if somebody puts controls, then we treat it as a discrimination.
Tushar, that brings me to the question of the involvement of the princely states, some of the princely states that you have mentioned, Alwar and Gwalior in particular. We know that these, especially Gwalior, was a state that supported the British, even at the time of 1857 revolt. So there are certain people who have had a history of betraying the freedom movement, and also the movement for establishing a new India post 1947. If you could talk a little bit about that and how it ties into vision of India, of the RSS.
You must understand, Shireen, that for the princely states, the freedom of India also meant the loss of their own hereditary power. from being gods, they were going to be reduced to becoming ordinary mortals with no power at all. Just imagine how traumatic that sense would be for them, for all these princely states, who realized that if they lost the patronage of the British, they would not, and if there was a democratic government at the national level, that democratic government was not going to be benevolent and say, okay, you remain the prince in your provinces, but you remain subjugated to us, because that would never have worked. And so the realization had happened that the day the British leave will be the death knell of our powers, our divine powers, because till then they believed that they were the gods of those who they ruled. And so for them to sustain or maintain that position, they had to subvert the idea of Indian democracy. So there was no, I'm not surprised that they grasped at the straws that were thrown to them. Two needs found each other: the preservation need of the princes and the political ambitions of the Sangh, of the
Very
Hindu
well put.
right wing,
Yeah, very well put.
found each other. And they could both exist if they united. And the greatest threat to them was the secular democratic idea of India. And if you look at it today, the descendants of the Sanghis are once again subverting the secular democratic idea of India. So again, nothing new. The same pattern has been going on. And so there is no surprise in the realization that came and the revelation that came from Kapoor Commission's report, that there was an involvement of the princely states in the conspiracy to kill Bapu also, and a larger conspiracy to subvert the Indian secular democratic notion also. Gandhi's murder was supposed to be the trigger of the coup against the government of India and overthrowing of that, and the establishment of a governing council of princes and the Sanghis.
In fact, you have mentioned that the weapon that killed Gandhi also came from the private collection of the King of Gwalior.
The weapon that came from the court of Gwalior. It was supposedly the war trophy brought from the Second World War by the ADC of the King of Gwalior. The link between how that gun went from the ADC to the gun runner and then to Godse was never investigated. For some strange reason, that was left as a lacuna. That
Although
could
one
have
doesn't
linked the
need,
court.
yeah, one doesn't need much imagination to
But
figure out.
Shirin, you must understand the fact that in such a case, they investigate the money trail, they investigate how the weapons came, where they came from, how did they get them. Everything is investigated. It's not left loose like this. In the Gandhi murder trial, the sources of funding for these murderers were known, and yet they were not investigated. So how the gun reached the various stages before landing in Godse's hands was never established, never investigated. It lends one to believe that there was a need to allow certain people to escape the noose
But
in the
Tushar,
Gandhi murder.
it baffles me that the people who try to protect these connections are also the people who would have suffered had a coup actually happened. So what I'm trying to say is that the people who were running the Indian state at that time had everything to lose if the princely states had managed to do what they were planning to do, i.e., start a coup against the Indian government. So why would the Indian government then not make sure that that connection comes to light, the connection between the Sangh and the princely states?
It came to light only in 65, 66, Shireen, in the Kapoor Commission's report. Till then, it was very. And you must remember that after Bapu's murder, many of the things that the government came to know about were used to quell those kind of forces and wag the finger at them and tell them to behave themselves. You must also remember at that time, the Congress had not been purged of the communal element. Today's communalists were still part of the Congress and the part of the government at that time. Because Congress at that time was still that huge, large umbrella coalition that had come together for the freedom of India. And it was a very short time for the dissolution of that umbrella coalition. And so these elements were part and parcel of the government also. And if you look at it finally, the sane element, the secular element, the liberal element, if you removed all these other, the shadow players or the fifth columnists inside the government, was in a minority. And so it is very natural that they would have said, let's use this advantage to assert our dominance rather than go after them and force them into a coalition openly against us.
That explains it well, because I was wondering that, when I heard the interview, I was like, well, if it's detrimental to the government, why would they not expose it?
Remember that in birth, India was like a baby which was born with its heart outside its body, its brain herniated, its intestines jumbled up. The worst kind of birth. And the government, which was the doctor who was desperately trying to save the life of that infant. If you look at the circumstances in which India was born and the first 3-4 year period of India's birth, you will realize that if it was an infant, I think the doctors would have given up on its chance of survival and said, bhajan karo, pray to God for a miracle. And you must remember that Nehru, Patel, all of them, they had their hands full with problems that were, like a jack in the box, springing out of that box on a basis of every second. And they were rushing to try and, keep the lids shut all over. And in doing that, at one point of time, I think they just got tired of it. And they said, okay, too much about it. Sardar openly said it. Sardar at mind was a radical person. He did not like the passive resistance idea at heart. He believed that there was a time for radicalness and he believed there was a time for tit for tat. I would not call Sardar communal. What I would call Sardar would be communally naive. He didn't realize that what he considered to be upfront kind of an attitude was actually a detrimental attitude. He was naive in that sense.
Well,
he did not realize
that he did not have the humanity of Bapu. You see, Bapu could go beyond. Bapu would look at Frontier Gandhi and say, he's my brother. He would look at Nehru and say, he's my son. He didn't have that lens.
No, I think Sardar was blind to the shades that humanity has. He only saw them in contrast, black or white. That was his flaw.
Anyway, that's a matter of, I think, another conversation.
But you must also, Shireen, learn to differentiate between the freedom fighters and the political leaders. There were two different identities that they had to live with. As the government, they had to make all those political compromises and things, which became easier for them to make once Gandhi was removed from the scene. The keeper of morality was removed. and they then got the leeway to be power savvy, do things that were required to be in power, remain in power. And you must not grudge them that, because they were no longer freedom fighters. They were political animals, and their only objective was power and remaining in power. And that is their Raj Dharma. That
I
is
don't
their
know.
Raj Dharma.
I don't know, Tushar. I think I may disagree on that a bit looking at the situation in South Africa now, because we had high hopes from this country when it got independence. And, we thought it will move towards a more egalitarian, a more just society. And I'm not at all saying that you can compare what's happening in India to what's happening here. But the fact is that they have followed the same set of economic policies that their predecessors were following.
Shireen, the fact is that we don't have leaders who are courageous enough to take the bitter pill and administer the bitter pill. They are insecure people who do not have the courage to put the gun to their head. Neither do they have the courage to take the whip and say, look, this is what is required for the next 20 years. You better do it, or it won't work. They want to do populist things. And today, in every democracy, mobocracy is prevalent than the real democratic ideals. Whether it is the US, whether it is Europe, whether it is England, whether it is South Africa, or whether it is India, we just fool ourselves into believing that we are a democracy. What we are is a majoritarian mobocracy.
Which is manipulated by an oligarchy. So in the case of
Absolutely.
India, there's like just 2 or 3 people who are running the show pretty much, and their financial interests are what are basically guiding the whole policy.
But Shireen, then what is power today? It's either authoritarianism, or it is power that buys things. So money power or muscle power. And today democracy is hostage to both. In every democracy, if you look at it, it's that way.
One day we should also have a conversation about how these countries developed, post independence, and what actually went wrong and how it could have been corrected. Tushar,
in South Africa, Shireen, I have noticed, if we talk about South Africa, I have noticed it is following the same path as India. Those who sacrificed sort of convinced themselves that because of their sacrifice, they deserve rewards. And that how much of a reward they deserve is not finite. The more they get, the more they want. In like both the countries, that is what has happened.
When it comes to society, especially economics and resources and economic justice, Gandhi is very poorly understood. We are mostly concentrating on his philosophy of peace, not concentrating on his philosophy of justice, which includes economic justice. And the way things are in India today, economic justice has been thrown out of the house. It's not there anymore, whether it comes to jobs or basic services. Gandhi would have been totally opposed to the kind of economic policies India is pursuing today. And I also feel that perhaps that's the reason why Gandhi is a huge threat to any fascist government, because a fascist government, as we know, is a corporate-run government. What are your thoughts about that? And also your thoughts about what Gandhi would have liked India to do, what kind of direction Gandhi would have liked India to go to when it comes to economic policies?
I think if Bapu was there, you see, the problem with Gandhian ideology is that we who claim to be followers of that Gandhian ideology has also compartmentalized it. Peace for us is just communal or societal peace. Justice is something different. Economy is completely different. It's not to be touched. But we forget the fact that Gandhi's idea of peace included everything. It included justice, it included economic justice, it included equality, not only in societal terms, but in economic terms also. It was a society based on trusteeship. His idea of peace was a society based on trusteeship, with everything was held in trust. Nothing was private except for ability. And even that was held in trust by, was supposed to be held in trust. But Bapu said that even your surplus time does not belong to you, it belongs to the society. Your surplus talent belongs to society. Now, if you start looking at it from that side, then you actually understand Gandhiism. What Gandhi meant in his idea of peace and justice and equality. That is what it meant, that everything was just. It wasn't compartmentalized at all. But because of our own convenience, we have compartmentalized things and said, no, no, Gandhi is good for equality or love or peace, but economy is totally different. For economy, we need Trump. And that is the excuse that we make to ourselves.
Yeah. And also the government does it too. They put him on this Swachh Bharat campaign, but when it comes to actual justice issues, they ignore him completely.
Because they ignore the fact that he said that before you have clean environment, you need to have a clean conscience. You need to have a clean soul. The Atma Shuddhi was as important, was even more important than the Bahya Swachhata. And so it's okay, you've given a jhadu to Bapu. So you've given yourself an excuse कि बापू को झाड़ू मारने के लिए हमको गंदगी करनी पड़ेगी ना, नहीं तो वो बुद्धा झाड़ू कहाँ मारेगा? You have made him into a cleaner, but you have not adopted clean practices yourself. And so it's just an escapism module, and that is what has been done in everything. So when there is no justice, there is no justice in anything. There will be no justice in economy. There will be no justice in equality. There will be no justice in the justice system itself. Where a Chief Justice of this country is willing to listen to the plea by a media brat to seek bail against anticipated arrest in the middle of the night, but for 2 years does not have the time to rule on a constitutional crisis in Kashmir. Where is the justice there? Where is the system of justice also? Because justice has to be seen to be done. No? When you have such abnormalities, what is seen is that yes, justice is for certain people, not for everybody. And what did Gandhi say? That Antyodaya. You remember that one word, it's very important. The last being in life, in the chain of life. He didn't even limit it to humanity. He said even the environment, the smallest life form, is as important as God's perfect creation. And only when you start behaving in that manner can you truly be called a just person. But we are not. Our notions are confined. In India, it's confined to our caste and gotra. But in more egalitarian societies, it's confined to the human species. Doesn't go beyond that. That is where even today, environmental rights are to be talked about, animal rights are to be talked about and fought for, and things. So, where is the justice? There is no justice. Human beings have reverted back to being the selfish individual rather than the society forming individual. The individual who went from the lone hunter-gatherer to creating societies and civilization is reverting back to becoming that lone hunter-gatherer, not bothered about anything else. worldwide. That is the phenomenon that we see everywhere.
So I think we need to keep in mind that Gandhi is much bigger than even the supporters of Gandhi, unfortunately, have portrayed him as, which is,
Absolutely.
this one person who sits in a corner and sings a bhajan and, doesn't want any hatred and violence. His thing was a much deeper, much wider philosophy that we need to recapture.
Today, if at all, Gandhi is important. It is the ideal that is important and not the human. And that is where, when this whole worldwide movement of destroying his statues began, I said, yes, I support the movement to destroy his statues. Because as long as those statues remain, we will never try to understand the ideals of that man. Because then we will have an object to focus on our worship and our hatred on. So let's get rid of that, because the idea of Gandhi is much more important than the Mahatma himself.
Tushar, you mentioned press. You mentioned this one particular case where an anchor, a so-called journalist, was doing all these things, and he was he got bail from the court. Basically, social media also plays into it, like you were saying, this trolling that you mentioned on your Twitter. Gandhi was way ahead of his times when he started a newspaper, because he did feel that the message has to go out, it has to reach people, and he used media for a very positive purpose. That was to unite people and also talk about the ills of society and so on. Today, the majority of Indian media is not fulfilling its role. Are there any things that you feel should be done by progressive elements in society that can help change this situation?
Well, I think we could emulate what Gandhi did. If you look at his publications were never dependent on revenue from advertising. I remember my great grandfather, who was sent back to South Africa to run the Indian Opinion, to publish it. Many a times pleaded with Bapu to allow him to have advertisements in Indian Opinion. And Bapu point blank refused. He said, you rather close it down if you can't run it, but don't take advertisements. And it wasn't as if he just laid down the rule. He explained, he said, the day you start accepting advertisement, even if you decide that you're going to only sell 10% of that periodical for advertising, the people who start purchasing that 10% will want at least a 10% say in the editorial that you publish. And they'll come and tell you, yeah, the article, if you print this article, you're driving my clientele away. People who patronize me don't want to read these radical views of it. And then you will have to start compromising, because you've gone dependent on that 10%. Today, if you look at the media, it is a for-profit corporate entity. It is not an institution anymore. Its policy is dictated to by its advertising department. The advertising department even tells the editor how much space he or she is going to get for editorial, because they are selling it and the owners want that. You look at the media holdings today in India, especially, you will see that they have gone into the hands of corporate bosses whose main business is some other industry which is dependent on government largesse. And so they don't want to rock the boat. So editors are just the title editor is there. They're plainly story writers. They are worse than, cub reporters of old times who were told that, I want 15 lines on this subject. And then the editor would sit and check every line and then say, you're an idiot. I don't know. The editors today are like that. And the smart editors are the ones who have said, okay, I will fill the need that is in the market. If my owner is going to make money, why don't I make money and get power also? Because I'm in front of the camera. So it's a big business. And when something becomes a business, then all the principles of business apply to them. They become the servants and slaves of the consumer. Today's society has also become a consumer of news, not a utilizer of news. And so they also want to listen to news that they feel better. They don't feel disturbed. They don't want to be disturbed in their living rooms by news of a Dalit girl being multiply raped and mutilated in Uttar Pradesh. जैसे हम माँ बहनों के साथ बैठे हैं, how can we listen to this? So we listen to a channel which does not show that. And the editor will say, okay, I showed this story, I lost TRP. So next time, even if there is a more gruesome story, I'm not going to show that.
And
I'll show the naked corpse of the Harijan girl because people will get titillated by that. But I will not tell the story of that savagery that happened.
And Tushar, what about social media? So there's this study that recently came, maybe you've heard of it, where the Columbia University and some of the IITs joined in, and they found that WhatsApp especially was spreading venom. Also because WhatsApp is a hidden medium. I mean, what goes on in your WhatsApp group, only you know. So if you are promoting violence and hatred, it's your people and you do it. And the Home Minister of India has gone on record saying that they use the WhatsApp groups for getting votes in a very big way. What is your opinion on that?
Shireen, over here, we must understand that freedom in any form, whether it is freedom of opinion, freedom of speech, right to that opinion, right to that speech, is something that will be used and abused if it is not sort of controlled by responsibility. And today, what we have adopted is irresponsible freedom of opinion. There is no responsibility of that opinion. Even if I know that a WhatsApp message is a fake, I, at the most, to show that I am conscientious, I'll say forward it as received, but I will not stop from forwarding because I want to be a popular guy in my group, somebody who sends a lot of stuff out. And so I am not an opinion maker, I am just an opinion sharer. And so I have abdicated my right to have freedom of opinion and speech because I am now an abuser of freedom of opinion and speech. And WhatsApp and social media provides that medium to opportunists, saying, okay, we are ensuring your anonymity. So there is a buffer. And if you look at Twitter, where hate is so rampant, you will notice that most of the handles that spread hatred have aliases as their handles. They don't have real names in that. There are quite a lot of people who do it openly, but majority of them have a pseudonym, a name where the individual is protected. And so that anonymity again gives you the opportunity to be a rascal. And so it is the abuse of the ideal of freedom that all these mediums are being subjected to and utilized for. And it's only leading to an excuse, to an ultimate authoritarian person saying, okay, no, you don't deserve those freedoms. Look at the many times where these mediums have been thought of being policed and laws have been created. They are not, even the current policy of the OTTs and things are not something to control the hate, but to promote that hate.
In fact, people who have used these technologies for something good, like Disha Ravi, they are
Yes.
arrested and put
Yes.
behind bars.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And Tushar, which reminds me that we do at Peace Vigil, we do these regular workshops on Islamophobia, caste, economic justice, and so on. And in Islamophobia workshop, we actually there's this one exercise we do with people where we give them a lot of profiles. So there are Facebook profiles and other profiles, and we ask the participants to guess who these people are, and everybody guesses ye single hogi, ye married hai, ye Muslim hai, you hai. In the end we tell them all your guesses are wrong because we don't even know whether these people exist. Matlab, aadhe time to the people we are fighting online, as you are saying, kya pata they are all anonymous or they have fake identities.
I would like to tell you the story. I believe you did an interview with Irfan Engineer. His father, Ashgar Ali, post the 92-93 riots in Mumbai, Ashgar Bhai worked with the Mumbai police because one of the findings post the riots, the inquiry commissions and things, was that Mumbai police was highly communalized and they had acted in a very communally biased manner during the riots. And that caused a lot of concern amongst the community. And so many initiatives were started to decommunalize the police. They all failed because they were insincere. But I remember Ashkar Bhai used to narrate this incident, like the workshops he conducted with policemen. And he said, I used to give them an exercise. I told them, I would say certain words, and immediately they had to write down their response to that word. And he said every time he said Muslim, the majority response from the police would be terrorist, gunda, extortionist, mafia, and the mildest would be antisocial kind of thing. So this is the kind of normalization of prejudice that we have inculcated in our society. It all springs from our stratification of society. For justifying every strata, we give it a certain label. The poor have to be poor because they are atoning for the sins from the previous birth. God has made them poor. That's their punishment. So it is a ordained thing that they must be poor. You must not help them, otherwise you're going against the design of God. And in the poor, then all the weaker sections come. So you're a Dalit because of the sins of your past life. You've been punished. Be thankful that you're at least a human being. You're not a Kida Makura. But we will treat you like a Kida Makura because it's a divinely ordained thing. So we have sort of created a system justifying all the prejudices leading to the hatred. And unless that whole system is dismantled, there is no panacea to this ailment.
Last question for you, and this is something that has come out of your book. There's this gun that comes from fascist Italy. It comes to Northern Africa. From there, it is transported to India, ends up in the state of Gwalior, which is run by a king. That gun is then used to kill Gandhi. It is used by Nathuram Godse, who is a supporter of the Hindutva philosophy. And in this whole journey, what strikes me the most is that a philosophy of hate, exclusion, homogenization, bigotry, prejudice, and another side, which is the side of love, cooperation, collective responsibility, development, and so on. And this contrast stands out to me. For you, as the great grandson of the Mahatma or Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and somebody who has done detailed research on the subject of his killing, I ask you, Tushar, what you find is the greatest threat to our beloved India and perhaps even to the world, and whether the death of Gandhi has lessons for us from which we could make the situation better.
Shireen, I think what is required today is that the gun came from fascist Italy, but the bullets came from the hate that was growing in India. And the same hate is thriving in India today, which is going to create many more bullets. And when you have those bullets, guns are immaterial. You know, the gun requires a particular bullet of a particular caliber, but a bullet can go into any gun, whether it's a Beretta or it's a Luger or it's a Glock or it's anything else. As long as the caliber matches, it will go into that and it will be fired. A Glock is not going to say that no, this is a Beretta bullet, I won't fire. Or a Colt is not going to say this is a Mauser bullet, I'm not going to fire. He said, okay, it fits into my barrel, I'm going to fire it and will kill. The bullet of hate, forged by hate, is what we need to get rid of. The guns will fall silent if we don't have bullets. The ideology of Gandhi was to emasculate the gun by denying it the bullet. We will have to do that today. Unfortunately, we're going after the guns and forgetting the bullets. And the greatest and the most threatening bullet is the bullet of hate that we nurture within our own selves. And that is why the killings of Dabholkar, Pansare, Kalburgi, and Gauri Lankesh remain without justice for so long. The murder of Ehsan Jafri remains without justice for so long because the bullet of hate has desensitized us to the loss of human life. Dabholkar was a rationalist. Rationalists are a threat to religion, so he is justified. Pansare is was a communist. Communists are a threat to life, so his murder is justified. Kalburgi was a rationalist. A rationalist has no place. It is anti-Hindu, so his murder is justified. Gauri Lankesh was a danger. She was a Naxal, urban Naxal, so her death is justified. Ehsan Jafri was a Muslim. How can you allow Muslims to live? So his death is justified. So the bullet that is within our hearts is responsible for the deaths of all these people. Because we have allowed their deaths to go in vain today. And so we must identify that bullet within our own selves that we so willingly provide to the murderers. And I think if Bapu was alive, he would have led a life of removing the gunpowder from the bullets and leaving empty shells which would not fire. And then the guns would fall silent.
What an amazing answer, Tushar. I think your talent as a writer shows through. And that seed of hatred or mistrust or whatever it is has to be there for anybody to come and manipulate it. And
Shireen, I have always admitted that the state we have reached today, I am responsible for it. Because for too long I convinced myself that it was a lunatic fringe that was creating all that. And I kept telling myself it's of no significance. Till it became a all-prevailing, all-crushing monster. And I am responsible for it to thrive because I was complacent all the time. I saw the signals, I saw the symptoms, and I said, no, this will go away. This is a temporary phase. We are the land of Buddha and Gandhi. But neither is Buddha there, nor is Gandhi. And I am responsible. I am responsible. Because I still believe that I am the true voice of India. I am the soul of India. I am the liberal guy. But I am the culprit. And unless I admit that and make amends for it, there is no cure.
Yeah, because many people do say things like, oh, it's really a minority, and most people
Raj bhi,
don't.
even today they are saying that it is a lunatic fringe that is doing that, without realizing that the state is being ruled by a fanatic bigot. A country is being ruled by a coalition of fanatic bigots. And we are still trying to tell ourselves that it's a lunatic fringe.
True. And Tushar, also I find that people who say, "Main to politics mein nahi jata," this is not really something I do. They are also supporting because they end up voting for these people. They say, main political nahi hu, this is not something that I do. They also end up voting for these guys.
Yes, because finally on the election day, I will justify it saying, Modi nahi to kya Lalu? Even though the time has come ki Modi nahi, Lalu bhi chalega. At least talking from the Indian point of view.
True. And this whole thing of alternative nahi hai, to you have to create the alternative.
In a democracy, we have to create a alternative. No? One point of time, we abuse the dynasts. And the other point of time, people come and tell me, why aren't you obeying your responsibility? You're the great grandson of the Mahatma. I could be Ravan or Nathuram, but I am the great grandson of the Mahatma. So I am supposed to do that. But then I will say dynasty is what is causing all the problems. So this duplicity that we have in our society.
That won't, yeah. But you are helping the cause by bringing to light the facts that have remained hidden, or even if they were not hidden, they were not publicized. So, you are doing your bit, and everybody does their bit in the way possible for them or what they are good at. I mean, I know that you tried your hand at politics, it didn't work, and so it's okay.
I think nothing is insignificant. Today I have come to the conclusion that no act is insignificant. Every act has a cumulative effect, and we must never ever stop, no matter how, even when we consider it to be insignificant. We should have the honesty to do it and say, okay, it may be of no consequence, but I'm doing it. And it always has a consequence. It always has a consequence.
Well, thank you, Tushar from South Africa, for giving us this time. I hope people take inspiration and courage from all the things you talked about. I do agree that the situation is quite grim in India. Civil liberties are at stake. People's simple right to stand up against injustice, to even speak about it, is at stake. And in these times, one is reminded of your great-grandfather, who did so much, not only for his own country, but for the world, by talking of issues and fighting for justice. And many people supported him then, and many people support him even today. So we wish you all the best in your continued journey to find out more about your great-grandfather, about his ideas, and also sharing them with the rest of people around you. We want to encourage people to read your book.
The new version will be out in a few months.
Okay, great. So I will wait for that. So when it comes out, I'm sure it will be on Amazon, US. Then
it is available on Amazon, yes. Okay. Although it is only supposed to be for India, but Amazon sells it.
Otherwise, what we can do is perhaps mail.
You can even place the orders with the. But I'm sure you'll be able to do it through Amazon, because the First edition also was only supposed to be sold in India, but Amazon was selling it worldwide. But Shireen, I'm going to correct you on your last statement. Let's wish both of ourselves, because all of us collectively have to fight this monster. And it's not just the monster in India, the monster worldwide. Hate is a pandemic much greater than COVID is. COVID is going to be triumphed over, as Bill Gates has prophesied in 2022, it's going to be gone. And if he says so, then it will be gone. But hate, even a Bill Gates is not going to be able to prophesize when it will be gone. And so today, for all of us, solidarity against hate is what we require.
I agree, Tushar. We, as our motto for Peace Vigil, it is peace needs all of us. And we have held on to that belief from day one, because each person's actions matter. And unless we actually are able to change all the minds and all the hearts away from hatred to love and cooperation, we wouldn't have actually survived as a species if we hadn't cooperated. So both love and cooperation are needed for us to survive. And also, as you mentioned, for the rest of the earth, it's not just us. So thank you so much, Tushar. It was a pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure, Shireen.
You were listening to a Peace Vigil conversation with author and activist Tushar Gandhi about the murder of his great-grandfather, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. The interviewer was Peace Vigil's co-founder, Shireen. The music for the title song is by Jeremy Karodia, Samir Dosani, and Shireen. The artwork is by Lal Bahadur. Remember to subscribe to this channel and share the interview. Your actions matter. Peace needs all of us.